Islam Makhachev did not rise through noise, rebellion, or spectacle. His career didn't announce itself, it endured. And that endurance is where the tragedy begins. Long before the belt, long before the arena lights followed his walkout, Islam Makhachev spent years in a strange professional void. He was winning consistently, efficiently, convincingly, yet almost nothing around him moved. No surge of attention, no acceleration of opportunity, no moment where the system suddenly decided, now it's your turn. For most fighters, victory is supposed to shorten the road. For Islam, it stretched it. This is not the kind of tragedy built on loss or scandal. It's quieter, harder to recognize, more corrosive. Islam's loneliest years were defined by a paradox that few fighters survive psychologically, doing everything right and being rewarded with nothing that feels like progress. He wasn't avoided because he was unknown. He became unknown because he was avoided. And in a sport driven by momentum, that kind of silence can be suffocating. While others built narratives, rivalries, and identities, Islam built a record that didn't sell itself. Each win made him more dangerous and less desirable. Opponents didn't call him out. Promoters didn't rush to frame him as the next star. He existed in a narrow space where excellence worked against visibility. Too dominant to hype, too methodical to romanticize, too consistent to turn into drama. This video is not about hardship in the traditional sense. It's about isolation at the elite level, about what happens when a fighter spends years sharpening himself without an audience, without affirmation, without the feedback loop that tells you your sacrifices are being noticed. Islam wasn't struggling to survive. He was struggling to be seen, and that kind of loneliness changes people. It changes how you fight, how you think, how you relate to risk. When nothing external responds to your success, you stop performing for the outside world. You start optimizing inward. You stop chasing moments. You start removing variables. You become efficient, not because it's elegant, but because it's safe. By the time Islam Makhachev finally reached the position the sport said he had earned, he was no longer shaped by ambition alone. He was shaped by years of silence. Years where the only proof of progress was survival itself. This is the tragic real-life story of those years. Not the years when Islam became champion, but the years when he became something colder, lonelier, and far harder to stop. During those years, the most painful part wasn't the waiting, it was the absence of resistance. Fighters didn't rush to test themselves against Islam Makhachev. They didn't chase the challenge. They didn't build rivalries around his name. Instead, they quietly adjusted their careers to avoid him. And that kind of avoidance creates a unique form of isolation that no crowd ever sees. In combat sports, conflict is validation. Being called out means you matter. Being targeted means your presence is felt. Islam experienced the opposite. He became the name that stalled divisions, the matchup that killed momentum, the fight that offered maximum risk with minimal reward. Wins against him didn't build stardom. Losses to him erased it. So the system learned to step around him. This wasn't a conspiracy. It was incentives doing their job. As Islam kept winning, the space around him grew emptier. Cards filled up. Divisions moved. Contenders rose and fell. And he stayed in the same place not because he wasn't good enough, but because he was too good in the wrong way. No chaos. No volatility. No selling point beyond inevitability. He didn't create highlights that demanded replay. He created outcomes that discouraged participation. For a fighter, this is a brutal psychological environment. You train for conflict, but conflict never arrives. You prepare for escalation, but everything stays flat. Every camp feels like preparation for a future that refuses to come closer. And when the sport stops responding to your success, you're forced to draw motivation from somewhere colder. This is where Islam's style hardened. Without external affirmation, he stopped seeking reactions altogether. He stopped trying to impress judges, crowds, or narratives. He refined a way of fighting that didn't depend on being wanted. He built a system that worked, even when the sport preferred to look elsewhere. Efficiency became a form of armor. Control became a substitute for recognition. The tragedy isn't that Islam was ignored. It's that he adapted perfectly to being ignored. He learned to win without witnesses, to dominate without applause, to improve in silence. And when you do that long enough, The sport no longer feels like a stage. It feels like a closed room where only outcomes matter. By the end of these years, Islam Makhachev wasn't just a dangerous contender waiting his turn. He was something more unsettling, a fighter shaped by absence, by the lack of resistance, by the long stretch where excellence didn't echo back at him. Those years didn't break him. They emptied him of everything except what worked. Over time, the silence did something subtle but irreversible. It rewired how Islam understood risk. For most fighters, risk is a currency. You spend it to gain attention, momentum, leverage. You take chances, because chances move careers forward. During Islam's loneliest years, that equation collapsed. Risk stopped offering upside. It only threatened the one thing he still controlled: progress without permission. So he changed what progress meant. Instead of chasing moments, Islam began removing them. Instead of creating volatility, he minimized it. His fights became quieter, not because he lacked aggression, but because aggression no longer made sense. Why gamble when the system had already shown that even winning loudly didn't move the needle? Why expose yourself when safety was the only form of consistency the sport still allowed you? This is where the tragedy deepens. Islam didn't become cautious out of fear. He became cautious out of clarity. He understood something many fighters never do. If the world isn't watching, spectacle has no value. Only survival does. Only certainty does. Only outcomes that can't be argued away. Loss, in this environment, became unthinkable. Not because it would end his career, but because it would justify the years of silence. A single setback could erase everything he had built quietly. It could confirm every excuse used to ignore him. So Islam began fighting not just to win, but to eliminate explanations. This is why his style stopped offering openings. He didn't want debates. He didn't want split decisions, close rounds, or highlight risks. He wanted results that left no room for interpretation. Every adjustment he made pushed him further away from the kind of fighter fans fall in love with and closer to the kind fighters dread. Psychologically, this is a lonely place to live. You're not performing for applause. You're not building a persona. You're protecting a trajectory that no one else seems invested in. Training becomes internal. Motivation becomes private. The cage stops feeling like a proving ground and starts feeling like an audit. And when fighting becomes an audit, creativity disappears. Islam's loneliest years didn't just strip away recognition. They stripped away indulgence. There was no room for emotional fighting, no room for ego-driven risks, no room for identity beyond efficiency. He became a fighter whose primary goal was not to be celebrated, but to be unavoidable. That's the cost of winning in silence. You don't develop joy. You develop discipline without softness. And once that discipline hardens, it doesn't melt just because the spotlight finally arrives. Those years didn't teach Islam how to fight better. They taught him how to fight without needing anything back. When opportunity finally arrived, it didn't meet the version of Islam Makhachev the system expected. It met something far less negotiable. By the time real contention was on the table, Islam was no longer chasing alignment with the sport's rhythms. He had spent too long operating outside them. Years of silence had taught him that momentum could vanish overnight, that attention could be withdrawn without explanation, and that validation was conditional at best. So when doors finally opened, he didn't step through them carefully. He walked in already prepared to close them behind him. This is the collision point of the tragedy. The sport prefers fighters who can be shaped by opportunity, who grow louder, riskier, more expressive when the spotlight turns on. Islam did the opposite. The closer he got to the top, the colder he became. He didn't expand. He compressed. He didn't adapt to visibility. He insulated himself from it. What the UFC and its audience encountered was not a contender eager to belong, but a fighter who had already learned how to exist without belonging. He wasn't grateful in the way the system expects. He wasn't reactive to pressure. He didn't perform urgency. He treated opportunity like another variable to be controlled, not celebrated. This is why his ascent felt uncomfortable to many observers. There was no transformation arc, no emotional payoff, no moment where the waiting years suddenly made sense in a cinematic way. Islam didn't soften when the world finally paid attention. He didn't become more relatable. He became more exact. The loneliness had done its work. Instead of learning how to sell himself, Islam had learned how to deny access to opponents, to momentum swings, to narratives that demanded vulnerability. He had spent too long being ignored to risk exposure now. The system couldn't pull him into chaos because chaos had never rewarded him. Stability had. So, when fights that were supposed to define him arrived, they didn't define him at all. They confirmed what those quiet years had already produced. A fighter who doesn't negotiate with expectation. A champion who doesn't trade efficiency for approval. Someone who had learned, painfully and privately, that survival without recognition is still survival. This is the moment most tragedies would resolve, where suffering is redeemed by success. Islam's doesn't resolve that way, because success didn't erase the years of isolation, it validated them. It proved that the cold, closed system he built in silence worked better than anything the sport had offered him. And once that realization set in, there was no reason to ever open back up. By the time Islam Makhachev stood where the sport said he belonged, the loneliness had already done its final work. There was nothing left to correct, nothing left to soften. The years without attention didn't fade into the background. Once success arrived, they set the terms of everything that followed. This is the quiet tragedy at the center of Islam Makhachev's story. The system eventually rewarded him, but it did so too late to shape him. He didn't arrive as someone looking to be embraced. He arrived as someone who had learned how to function without being wanted. And fighters like that don't change once the lights get brighter. When recognition finally came, it didn't feel like relief. It felt procedural. Another step to manage, another environment to control. Islam didn't celebrate momentum because momentum had betrayed him before. He didn't open himself to emotion because emotion had no utility during the long years when no one was listening. What remained was a fighter who treated every fight, even at the highest level, as a continuation of isolation, not an escape from it. That's why his dominance feels unsettling. He doesn't perform greatness, he executes it. He doesn't seek affirmation from opponents, crowds, or narratives. He removes their ability to affect him. The loneliness didn't disappear when he became champion. It calcified. It turned into a way of existing where nothing external is required to function at full capacity. Most tragic stories promise transformation at the end. Pain leads to understanding. Isolation leads to connection. Islam's story doesn't offer that comfort. His loneliest years didn't prepare him to rejoin the sport emotionally. They prepared him to outlast it. And that's why watching him fight can feel so cold, so quiet, so inevitable. You're not seeing someone finally enjoy the rewards of suffering. You're seeing someone who learned, a long time ago, how to win without expecting anything back. That is the real tragedy of Islam Makhachev's loneliest years. They didn't break him, they finished him. There's a version of this story that should end differently. One where success heals the damage, where recognition replaces isolation, where the years of silence finally receive an answer. Islam Makhachev never got that version. His rise didn't resolve the loneliness, it confirmed it. It proved that everything he built in isolation was not only necessary, but optimal. That the cold discipline, the emotional distance, the refusal to perform for anyone but himself worked better than belonging ever could. And once that lesson is learned, it can't be unlearned. This is why Islam Makhachev doesn't fight like someone enjoying the moment. He fights like someone protecting a structure that kept him alive when nothing else responded. He doesn't open up to chaos. He doesn't invite narratives. He doesn't chase love from the crowd. Those things never helped him when he needed them most. The tragedy isn't that he was ignored. The tragedy is that he adapted perfectly to being ignored. And now, even as champion, he carries those loneliest years into every fight. Not as pain, not as anger, but as a system built in silence, refined without witnesses, and sealed long before the world decided to care. Islam Makhachev didn't emerge from loneliness. He brought it with him and turned it into something unbeatable.